So what we're going to do is just jump right into the conversation with Scott Sagan about the upcoming summit, really, between Kim Jong Un and President Trump. The meeting is on for
Next
June the
week?
12th. It seems that the president has accepted that at least in the short term, we'll be dealing with a nuclear North Korea. You've argued that deterrence can work under those circumstances, but the president's former national security advisor, H.R. McMaster, has said in the case of North Korea, it cannot. What are the arguments?
Well, we have been deterring North Korea from attacking the South since 1953. We've had an armistice, but we haven't had a complete end of the war. So deterrence has been in existence. We've had nuclear forces capable of wrecking North Korea for many, many years. What's changed is the North Koreans now have a capability to both attack Seoul, Tokyo, and some believe the United States. There's no consensus on that. So the question is, can we actually deter a state that has an ability to attack us from attacking our allies? Now, McMaster said deterrence doesn't work with a country that harms its own people, that murders the brother or the half-brother of the head of the country. And my counter-argument is that deterrence was created for countries like that. The question is, what do you threaten to do? The Nuclear Posture Review, which is the new official Defense Department statement, I think got it right by saying if Kim Jong Un ever starts a nuclear war, that we will destroy the Kim regime. The president did not get it right in the UN speech when he said we will totally obliterate North Korea, implying a massive attack, which A, is not very credible, and B, if it actually happened, I think would be illegal and deeply unfortunate.
So for a long time, the argument that we would retaliate with full force, no matter what the country is with, has it's always been hard to make that threat credible just because it's such a hideous act.
Right.
Some would say that the fact that Donald Trump used phrases like fire and fury and called Kim Jong Un Rocket Man, that he signaled in many ways, you're dealing with a different guy now. And I just would use nuclear weapons. There's sort of a madman approach. Was he smart to do that? Did that end up being effective in some way?
It may well have had some effect. I think more important than the madman statements were the sanctions, which were international in nature, were authorized by the UN, and until recently have been relatively well implemented by all the states parties. What I think has happened, in part because of the more extreme statements, was that the sanctions now are beginning to be loosened. Not officially, but there have been leakages through the North Korean-Chinese border. The Russians apparently have been making bargains on the side. So what I think, if you overstate your statements and your threats, it leaves the ROK, the Republic of Korea, and the other states involved to say, well, who's more dangerous, Kim Jong Un or Donald Trump? And increasingly, people were worried. So you might be right, that may have been a bargaining ploy, but it is also possible that he overplayed that hand.
Well, the wrong people were frightened by it.
Right.
It was more frightening to our allies. So what happened with the ZTE? Because there was this case of a Chinese telecom company violating the sanctions, also perhaps violating the Iran sanctions. We initially, our initial response was to go after that company, even to the point of perhaps driving it out of business. And then President Trump reversed himself.
Right.
What was that about?
If you're asking me to explain some of the logic of Donald Trump, I'm going to have a very hard time doing that today. I think what happens in the White House today is the president reacts on instinct. He makes deals and he cuts off deals. And he doesn't often see the connections between them. So you've mention both a Chinese company, which he may say, well, I don't want to do that because of the relationship is improving with China, but then he doesn't get the connections that what that would mean with respect to North Korea. The same with the Iran deal. So he decides that we're going to pull out of the nuclear agreement with Iran at the same time that he's entering into a bargaining position with Kim Jong Un.
Yeah.
Those two are not compatible, but for whatever reason, he thinks very tactically on one issue and doesn't see linkages to others. Some of his staff try to make those linkages for him, but he rejects their advice.
Now, some people argue that we should think about, in a deterrence situation, we should think about reintroducing short-range nuclear weapons into South Korea to sort of reinforce deterrence. Does that make sense to you?
I don't think it does. We have weapons that are offshore that could serve the same purpose. And the only reason to put them closer would be to put us in a lose it or use it situation. Right. Thomas Schelling, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, once said that the way to have a credible deterrent in a risky situation is to create what he called a risk that leaves something to chance. And a threat that leaves something to chance, like having tactical weapons on the border, may be more credible. But the problem with a threat that leaves something to chance is that it leaves something to chance. And that when you've got a volatile situation like that, I think you want to try to have your forces in reserve where you're in full command and control. I think the biggest problem we have in this regard, and again, it does get back to President Trump. This is an unusual situation that we've been in. In the past, when we've had crises, the military was often the problem, where the military was hawkish and had to be constrained by a more moderate president. Think about the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended an invasion and airstrike. And President Kennedy, reinforced by Robert McNamara, said, no, we're going to have a quarantine, we're going to put a blockade on and see if we can squeeze them and out to get them and make a deal privately over withdrawal of our missiles in Turkey. The Joint Chiefs of Staff went along with that in the end, but it took a moderate president to force the chiefs. Today we have the reverse situation, where it's the military that actually is constraining a president. So you see this, for example, when the military is asked, can you destroy all the missiles and all the nuclear forces? What would it take, Congress asked the Joint Chiefs, and they said it would require the occupation of North Korea. We can't do that. And that was a way of pouring cold water on some of the Trump and McMaster and at the time Tillerson's comments that became known as the bloody nose strategy. We might attack them in a limited way and then wait for them to be deterred by our forces, that they're going to take us seriously if we attack North Korea in a very limited way. That both assumes that North Korea would know that it was limited, which we shouldn't assume. And second, it doesn't make logical sense, because if you think that North Korea is so undeterrable, so irrational that we can't deter them in peacetime, why should you think that we can deter them after we've attacked them in a limited way? Yeah. But that's where we were 6 months ago, and I think this is an improvement to have talks rather than threats.
So deterrence is not without risk of miscalculation, misunderstanding. You've got both sides calling each other names at various points. And our intelligence is not all that good, is it, in North Korea? So what are the risks? Are there higher risks of miscalculation, given that we don't have the eyes on the country that we'd like to have?
I think there are severe risks. Now, let me talk about two of them. One is that even if you have a strong deterrent relationship, if you have both countries thinking that if the other side's about to attack, I want to preempt, which is the case today. In that instance, a false warning of an attack could trigger somebody to retaliate in their mind when in fact they're starting the war. It was a false warning. So we're all familiar with the incident that occurred in Hawaii, where there was a false warning that missiles were incoming into Hawaii. It panicked people on the spot, but not the national leadership at all, because in the United States we knew, one, that there wasn't a real attack occurring because we have redundant sensors, and none of the other sensors said there were missiles being launched. Two, we have professional officers who said, oh, we made a mistake, and told the truth to the people in charge. And three, we really didn't think that Kim Jong Un was about to start a crazy war. If that incident occurred in North Korea, all three of those conditions would not exist. One, they don't have a lot of redundant sensors. They rely on old-fashioned radar. If there was a blip that occurred that was misunderstood. Two, I think they're surrounded with yes men, and it would take a very brave North Korean officer, given how often North Korean officers, even at high levels, are executed for making mistakes, to say, yes, we made a mistake. And three, they do think we might attack them. Why? Because we keep telling them we might attack them if they don't make a deal. So while I think it's very good that we're going to have these negotiations, I also think that we're going to continue to have this problem of false warnings. And then the second problem that I see is that the North Koreans may have adequate comfort with their current nuclear capabilities. I doubt they have complete confidence in their missile capabilities today. And that's one reason why we're trying to make a bargain now.
Yep.
Maybe we can get them to have a moratorium and continue a moratorium so they'll have medium-range missiles, Seoul and Tokyo, all of South Korea, all of Japan, maybe Guam will be threatened, but maybe they're not confident about their ability to hit the United States yet. If we can get that deal, that's good. That would enable us to say, oh, we can still provide a credible deterrent for our friends because we are less threatened ourselves, although we still have bases there and lots of Americans still live in those countries. But if the North Koreans don't accept that, and they may have incentives in the future to start testing. They'll say, oh, this is a rocket test. It's not necessarily an ICBM test, or they'll do something in even an unannounced way. Then I think we're back into this real scary period of threats back and forth. So there's both a false warning problem and a real crisis escalation problem.
Right. And you're referring to missile tests when you're referring to tests, correct?
Correct.
And I mean, of course, one of the great criticisms that President Trump had of the Iran deal was that it didn't cover missiles, that it was about nuclear capability. It didn't cover missiles. It didn't cover their behavior in the region, in Yemen and Syria, and their support for Hezbollah. Do you imagine that the Trump administration, in this case, in the case of North Korea, is going to go for the combination of nuclear capability and missile capability in one deal?
Absolutely. So to me, the big difference with the Iran deal to this is that Iran was getting close to getting nuclear weapons, but they didn't have them. So what we shut off in the Obama administration was the speed by which they could move forward. We didn't eliminate their entire program, but they limited enough of it and had constraints on it in terms of the nuclear side, but we didn't constrain their missile side.
Right.
So what we're going to get, I believe, in the best case in Singapore, would be that there'd be an agreement to constrain their missile capability, but not their nuclear capability, because they already have it. Now there'll be a call for denuclearization, and this is my prediction, is that there'll be some kind of agreement that in exchange for us saying we now have an end of the war, and we'll sign off on something, that they'll say, okay, we'll have some constraints on our missile testing and we'll destroy something, and they won't agree other than on the nuclear side, other than the aspirational, we will move towards the goal of a nuclear-free Korean peninsula, and then we'll let the experts handle that. Donald Trump will declare victory, and Kim Jong Un will declare victory. He'll say, look, we stopped threats to the United States. We didn't solve the nuclear problem, but we stopped threats to the United States. Kim Jong Un, I think, would say, we've gotten the Americans to surrender. After all these years, he'll go home and say, oh, look, now I'm well respected. I'm having great leaders like Assad come to Pyongyang. I've been invited by Putin to go to Moscow. And that will create, I think, an incentive for him to say, okay, we want a nuclear-free Korea as our ultimate goal, but look how good our nuclear weapons have been. They've already achieved such big things for the North. So I think this is going to be a mixed blessing. I hope that it has this kind of success, but we should be careful of salesmen who tell you that this deal is really perfect.
Denuclearization may mean something different to the Trump administration than it means to Kim Jong Un's government. I mean, he has said, apparently, to the South that he, in fact, is committed to denuclearization of the peninsula, but does that, for him, include our commitment, our nuclear umbrella, our commitment to retaliate should South Korea be attacked? Does it include our bombers that are in Guam? In other words, what is the expectation on our side when he refers to denuclearization?
It depends on who you ask in our side, Jane. Many people look at this and say, Kim Jong Un is doing what the United States and the other nuclear weapon states did when we negotiated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We agreed under Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty that we would work in good faith towards the eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. President Obama tried to increase the fervor around that with the famous Prague speech and saying, I envision a world without nuclear weapons. We may not get there in my lifetime, but we will rededicate ourselves. And that is the law of the United States, because a treaty that's been ratified is national. Does that mean we really work really hard to get rid of nuclear weapons? No. We take step-by-step approaches to reduce our reliance on it when we have administrations that care about it, and we ignore it when we have administrations that don't. So the best we can get from the North Koreans, I think, is a similar kind of rhetorical statement that this is our goal, and they may adopt some limited steps to move in that direction, but it's going to take a long time. South Koreans and the North Koreans, when they met, they actually said we're going to have step by step. So they were clear saying that we want, in exchange for a reduction of exercises or some movement, they haven't specified what it will be, because they want to have a wait and see attitude to see what they can get in return for very specific steps.
And these are the joint military exercises between the U.S. and South Korea.
Correct. Correct. Or it could be that we want an agreement that you won't station nuclear weapons on Guam, and we want to have inspectors. And the United States, I think, would say, no, we're not going to do that. And then they'll say, well, how can we let inspectors into our country if you won't let inspectors onto your? And those are going to be long bargains. So we'll be living with nuclear deterrence with North Korea for a long time, I think.
Now, John Bolton might disagree with you.
John Bolton would disagree with me.
And so the current National Security Advisor to the President has written, I think it was back in March in the Wall Street Journal, that a preemptive attack would be permissible by us on North Korea, would be permissible under international law. What does preemption mean, and is it legal?
Well, what John Bolton did in his Wall Street Journal article was similar to what he did in 2002 and 2003, trying to prepare the American public for the war against Saddam Hussein, which is to conflate two different phenomena: the phenomenon of preemptive war and the phenomenon of preventive war. A preemptive war, or a preemptive attack, is when you believe an adversary's attack is imminent and unavoidable, and that you are launching a defensive, anticipatory retaliation. It's a desperate move when you think and you have intelligence that an attack is imminent. A preventive war is when you think that somebody is building something and in the long term threatens you, and that you decide you're going to start the war now rather than wait for them to develop future capabilities that would be threatening.
Basically what Israel did against Iraq's nuclear reactor and Syria's nuclear reactor.
Correct. So those were preventive strikes. I would note, however, that there's a difference between a preventive strike, which is a single strike against a force, and a preventive war. So what Bolton was arguing was that because of the speed of missiles and how quickly they could move across the world, that we no longer can follow the traditional view about preemption, which is it's a desperate act taken when an attack is imminent and unavoidable. And instead we should start it now, and that would be legal. And I think that's just faulty legal logic. The United Nations Charter has a term for such an attack. It's called aggression. And that just as Kim Jong Un would take an illegal act if he threatened and then executed a first strike against the United States because he thought we were threatening in the long term, we should also recognize that our preventive attack, if that was executed against North Korea, would be an illegal act. And I think it's unfortunate that we've gotten so used to some of the disregard of legal and ethical principles on the part of the Trump administration that that fact that the National Security Advisor was advocating an illegal act was largely ignored by the press. And that's why Alan Weiner and I wrote the New York Times article trying to point this out.
He's since gone even further to say that that our goal with these negotiations is to follow the Libya model. And as everyone in this room knows, in the case of Libya, Gaddafi voluntarily gave up his nuclear weapons capability and a decade later was overthrown and killed. It is precisely the scenario that has led Kim to pursue nuclear weapons capability. I mean, he may have many reasons, but one of his reasons is concern about regime change.
Absolutely. He saw what happened to Saddam Hussein and saw what happened to Muammar Gaddafi, and the North Koreans have repeatedly said that's not going to happen to us.
Right. What was Bolton, in your view, what was Bolton's purpose in doing that? Surely he knew how it would be understood. Was it an effort to undermine negotiations? Is it, or does he think it strengthens negotiations? What is the argument for saying such a thing while you're trying to negotiate a change in posture?
It's very hard from the outside to know what his motive was. The most positive statement one could make was that by talking about complete, verifiable, irreversible disarmament, he's laying out a sequence different than what is likely to happen, that we want you to have this complete, verified disarmament, and then we'll get rid of the sanctions. So it's sequencing, saying we want you to give up your program and then we'll give you something in return. That's the generous view. The less generous view is that he was hinting not just about the disarmament sequencing, but about if you don't go along with this, then there's going to be militarily induced regime change. Now, it wasn't clear what Bolton was saying. He was, in the official statement, was referring to disarmament, but he's bringing up a pretty nasty metaphor. What was shocking to me was that President Trump, instead of following the disarmament side of that metaphor, personalized it and said, didn't talk about the Libya model, talked about the Gaddafi model. And that's not talking about disarmament, that's talking about death of a leader and sexual mutilation of a leader. This was a really shocking statement coming from the President of the United States. Vice President Pence did not reverse the President's position. He repeated this statement that if you don't make a deal, you're going to suffer that kind of regime change. Now, I hope that that was well coordinated and part of a negotiation position. Tough bargaining, the madman theory. But it's also quite possible that the President misspoke and He's not necessarily known to follow the scripts that are given to him. He's very proud of acting on his own impulses. I hope that kind of thing doesn't happen in Singapore, or doesn't happen in the inevitable long process of bargaining that's going to continue on afterwards.
If you assume that John Bolton would, I'm personalizing it now, I realize, but if you assume that he would make the same case in private that he has in public, that if the negotiations break down, that he would recommend to the president a preemptive strike, what role would others play? What would you expect, for example, coming out of the Defense Department and the military? It's their job to offer options, to say what are the consequences of pursuing these various options. What do you imagine would be coming from beyond the West Wing of the White House?
Well, again, let me note that there's a real difference between a preemptive strike and a preventive strike. So if he said, if we have evidence that the North Koreans are going to launch tomorrow, they've taken all their missiles out and we see them fueling their liquid-fueled missiles, I think the president, with full support of the U.S. military, would order an immediate attack, and we'd have a victory, but it would be one in which the losses would be just horrendous, both in the United States and but certainly in South Korea and in North Korea. If Bolton is talking about a preventive attack, that they're going to start testing missiles again. They're not about to launch a war, and we need to attack them now because it's going to go sour in the long term. Then I think the military may or may not follow, depending on what their orders are. We're in this unusual position in the United States today where we've had Senate hearings about whether the president should have the authority to use nuclear weapons on his own, which he currently has. After those hearings, the head of the Strategic Command, General John Hyten, said, well, I would never follow an illegal order. Ever since My Lai, we've been trained that the responsibility of a military officer is to follow presidential orders or higher authority orders if they're legal, but if there's an illegal order, not to follow it. And that was reassuring to some people in the public. I don't think it should be. Because what Hyten was referring to was, I'm not going to follow an order that says, I want you to kill everybody in Pyongyang. That would be a violation of the laws of armed conflict and the principles of just war doctrine. A military officer's role is not to question whether to go to war, it's to question the kind of killing that goes on in a war.
Yeah.
And so I think it is likely that the military would say, sir, here are the options that we have for a preventive war, and we'll let your lawyers follow the John Bolton line that we'll label it as preemptive, and they would execute something, and it could be disastrous. Now, the good news is that Secretary Mattis apparently understands that fully, and he's been arguing against so-called bloody nose tactics, that we don't want to launch a war, and he's stated to Congress repeatedly that we need to have a diplomatic solution to this because the military solution is so deeply unattractive. But if the president decided to fire Secretary Mattis, or if the president decided, I want to order and start a war anyway, even though it is not provoked by an imminent attack by the North, I think that war would occur.
Do we have the capability to simply knock out their capability? That is to say, I mean, bearing in mind that they've got the ballistic missile capability, they've got nuclear weapons material, they've got actual nuclear weapons, can we, with any kind of assurance, launch strategic, sort of very strategic strikes that would simply eliminate their capability?
The simple answer is no. We have a capability to destroy a lot. We have a defense missile system, imperfect as it is in the United States and others in South Korea, that could destroy some missiles coming in. But with a nuclear armed missile, getting most of them is not enough. You have to get them all. So a single missile getting through to Seoul, depending on the yield, depending on where exactly it hits, could kill 600, 700,000 people. Same numbers could occur in Tokyo. Hitting a military base would kill fewer people, but would still kill tens to hundreds of thousands, depending on where those bases are located. So we lack the capability to have what would be called a splendid first strike, one that could totally disarm the North. And that's why the Joint Chiefs, when asked by Congress, can we destroy all of those capabilities? What would it require? They said to have occupation of the North. That's the only way we could really guarantee that. And when asked in the Nuclear Posture Review, they say we could have a capability to destroy some of the North Korean nuclear force, but emphasize not all.
So President Obama's preferred means of dealing with North Korea was to use cyber attacks to ensure that some of their missile tests would go awry. Have we lost that opportunity? Is that still available to us, or is the point of these cyber attacks that you don't have a return address, and yet it is now well known that we were behind them?
Cyber attacks are often done if you have a tricky way of delivering them. And once it is known that had that effect, then you've lost that element of surprise. So cyber capabilities of this sort are not something you can repeat. So we did that successfully with the Natanz, which is the Iranian uranium enrichment facility where the Israelis, reportedly with some American assistance, were able to get some cyber capabilities into Natanz. But and that got the centrifuges to go too fast and destroyed some of them. But once they figured it out, we couldn't keep doing that. So whatever it was that we did that got some cyber capabilities to attack the North Korean missile launches, whether we had placed something in the computer system, whether we had gotten something through the Ukrainians that went into the missiles themselves, we don't know. But whatever happened, they figured it out.
They know.
And they have solved that particular problem. So you can't use cyber in the same manner over and over again.
And we know that we're vulnerable to their cyber attack as well. At least they showed with the Sunny case that they've got a very sophisticated capability there as well. What happens when, I'm now back to a prior question, but what happens when a leader has nothing left to lose? If we did launch that attack, at that point, Kim had nothing left to lose. What do strategists think occurs at that moment? And you and I know a little bit about this from the missile crisis situation as well. But
well, in those particular cases, I think leaders decide that this might be the end, and I might as well let someone suffer the way that we are suffering. One of the most chilling speeches I've ever read was Saddam Hussein's secret speech to his launch officers, saying if I, Saddam, die because of an Israeli or an American attack against me in 1991, this is the first Gulf War, I want you to launch everything that we have, all our chemical and biological weapons capability against both Israel and Saudi Arabia, because they're behind this American dastardly attack. We don't know whether the officers would have actually executed such an attack, but we do know that he ordered such an attack. Now, there was testimony in Congress by a North Korean defector that the conventional artillery forces in North Korea have a similar kind of pre-delegated order, that if Kim Jong Un is killed, they're to launch everything that they have against South Korea, especially against Seoul. And that could kill many thousands of people. What we don't know is whether he's given similar orders to the nuclear forces. So I think the idea that we want to kill Kim Jong Un in any situation other than retaliation or a preemptive attack against convincingly positive evidence that he's about to launch an attack, I think would be insane. It would just lead, most likely, to a massive destruction of South Korea and Japan.
And what about, let's just imagine, very powerful sanctions staying on, the North Korea being really without the resources it needs for its people to survive? What about the temptation to sell nuclear weapons material on the black market?
I think the
He's got no other source of hard currency.
Well, we already know that the North Koreans have been involved, first off, in selling nuclear technology. This is the Syrian reactor that was being built that was destroyed by Israel in 2007, which was almost a replica of the reactor that the North Koreans had built. And then it was discovered that the North Koreans had actually shipped some of the material and were helping. Now, we don't know whether they actually shipped the material there. There's no evidence of that. And the Israelis destroyed it before that reactor went hot. So the material was not placed there. But it's hard to believe that the North Koreans were building a reactor for Syria that would produce plutonium for a nuclear weapon, and that they weren't going to give them the material afterwards. So at least we have at least one case. Now, we also know that the North Koreans have been very much involved in some of the selling of materials to the Syrian chemical weapons program. The UN just published a report recently outlining the number of North Korean entities that have been involved in shipping chemical-related technologies to Syria, which then use that to replenish their chemical stocks and then use them against their own people. So yes, the North Koreans are fully capable of doing this. If they do, we have to, I think, punish them severely. I would hope we wouldn't go to war over that, but we may have a belligerent reprisal. If a country violates an agreement, it does something, you should react in a harsh but proportionate way. So I would hope that we would both try defensives to make sure that we interdict anybody who does that, or anyone who's trying to do that. But yes, I could see retaliating against North Korea.
And what would that look like, the reprisals look like?
It would be a military attack against the site that we thought had made that material. That's at least would be what I think the Pentagon would follow. The Pentagon, the officers have been trained to think about the laws of armed conflict and think about proportionality, how to minimize collateral damage, to punish the entities that did something that was illegal or was against our interests, but not to try to kill a lot of people in doing so. Right. There are others who would say, no, we want to actually do something even worse. And you could take the case of what we did against the second Syrian large-scale chemical attack as a case in point. In this particular case, there was an argument reportedly inside the administration about, do we attack just the sites that delivered the chemical weapons and the chemical weapons facilities, or do we make a larger attack, including perhaps killing some Russians, since the Russians must have known about this? And in the end, President Trump, to his credit, ended up agreeing with the more limited attack to go in against the Syrian sites. His legal argument for doing so was not particularly strong, but the strategic argument for limiting your attack to a more proportionate response, I think, is a good one.
Yeah. Many of the question cards coming up relate to the motivations of Kim. One person asks whether he's trying to save his regime because, in fact, his power is eroding.
I think that's probably true. Whether these were the sanctions, the threats, or increased confidence that he has in his nuclear capabilities, for whatever reason, he's now willing to bargain and would like to meet with the President of the United States and to be seen on the world stage, and then to take that home and show his people that we're progressing and we want to help your lot. So I think he has to be concerned. He's doing lots of things to shore up his personal power, whether it's killing his brother or demoting military officers, killing his uncle. He's done a lot. The fact that he's done a lot suggests that he's worried about what things would be like if he did not take such harsh actions. So no, I think he has every reason to try to cut a deal, but he also has every reason not to trust the United States and keep some of his nuclear capabilities.
The same questioner notes that Donald Trump has said that he's going to make North Korea rich if it does go for denuclearization. What do you think Kim Jong Un hears when he says this? Is this one of his primary motivations to get rid of the sanctions? And what does President Trump mean by making them rich, other than lifting the sanctions?
Kim Jong Un is a mystery, and Donald Trump is also a mystery. Trump, I think, genuinely would like to see progress towards democratization and towards a better economic future for North Korea. But there are many people within the administration who view that as a recipe for regime change, and they want to try to overthrow the Kim regime. Knowing that, Kim Jong Un has to be very cautious. We talked earlier about the problems of how to make a threat credible. Even harder than making a threat credible is how to make a promise credible. How can Donald Trump promise that we're going to continue improving our relations? How can we continue having economic aid come? So in this sense, I think what Kim Jong Un is doing is what a smart leader would do, is hedge your bets, both against the United States, but also to appear to be the reasonable person so that you can cut deals with Vladimir Putin, with Assad, with other things that can get him money that would be beneficial to maintain his power. So I think he's playing a pretty smart game.
A question card here asks about the progress made under the Clinton administration, or the agreed framework, and the fact that that ultimately was violated by the North Koreans. Did we have any significant gains, at least for a while?
I think we did have significant gains. The North Koreans took their reactor and mothballed it. They took the materials that we had seen that they had taken some out of the reactor, presumably to do some testing of the plutonium to see if they could make a bomb out of it. They took the rest of the plutonium and put it under IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, inspectors. So we slowed down that program. Now, it is true that they had another program, the uranium enrichment program. Legally speaking, it wasn't a violation. Right. It was a violation of the spirit, but that they had done this secretly with Pakistani help in order to have a hedge in case the United States didn't follow through on our side of the agreement. But to be fair, we didn't follow through on our side of the agreement either. So they were hedging by not trusting the United States. We, in the Clinton administration, wanted to sell them reactors and started the process, but the Congress refused to go along with all of that. So I think the fault lies on both sides for not keeping the agreement.
The pressure on Donald Trump, having reneged, having pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement, isn't the pressure very significant that he achieves something somehow better, somehow more foolproof with the North? And another questioner asked whether there would be, how he could improve on the agreed framework. Wouldn't there be enormous pressure to come up with something somehow that is better?
I think there is enormous pressure, and I think the president knows that what happens in Singapore will be a signature moment for his presidency and for his re-election campaign. So therefore, he does have incentives to have some kind of agreement. I think it will be very limited, and it'll be very interesting to see the bargaining that goes along. I think the PR afterwards will be more flamboyant than the actual agreement. It will be much more positive. And that's going to be true whether you're in Pyongyang or in Washington, D.C. But I think the incentive for both Donald Trump and Kim Jong Un is to let this Singapore summit produce a positive outcome and reduce some of the tensions. The dangers will come if either side missteps, pushes the other side too far, and then either in Singapore or in the months and indeed years to come, it will take years to have North Korea have nuclear disarmament, because you'd have to have inspectors go in. Think about how long it took with Saddam Hussein after the first Gulf War, and even then we didn't fully trust, with all the UN inspectors that we had there, that he had fully disarmed. We're going to have a similar problem with North Korea, which has a lot more tunnels, better at deception than the Iraqis ever were. How can we trust that they're going to have complete, verifiable inspection? So even with goodwill, this will be hard. So there are many cliffs after this summit, and we have to be careful that neither side falls over any of them.
I'm struck by many of your answers. You're describing a situation in which both leaders really need a deal for domestic reasons. And they're, in the case of Donald Trump, he is out there touting the great deal he's going to, agreement he's going to reach, even reference to a Nobel Peace Prize for it. It'll be so extraordinary. He's painted himself into a corner of needing it more than you really want your side to need something. Does it make them both vulnerable in some ways?
I think the need to have a deal makes President Trump more vulnerable than Kim Jong Un. And that's because Kim Jong Un doesn't really care about what his people think on a day-to-day basis. And we've seen that by the way he treats his people. He may care about generals, he may care about people in his intelligence services or his family, but that's why he has sometimes punished them so that they can't threaten them. President Trump might like to have that capability, but he lacks it. He really needs public support. And so I think he has every incentive to make a deal, and that's why it's going to be very interesting to see. I hope that something positive can come out, but recognize that whatever can come out of an immediate meeting is just the start of a long process of negotiation between the U.S., North Korea, and then China will have to enter. Russia, the South Korea, and Japan. We used to have 6-party talks. Now we're having 2-party talks, although the Chinese will probably come in really quickly, as will the South Koreans. But this is going to be a long-term negotiation and a long-term interaction. And there are many dangerous missteps that any one of those actors could take.
While you're on a long-term vision, one of our question cards refers to a 100-year scenario. And in a 100-year scenario in which we had direct talks, we had diplomatic recognition over time, we eventually had trade, do you imagine a Germany-like outcome where you've got the reunification of the peninsula? And does that really take 100 years?
I don't think it would take 100 years. I do think that it is possible that a long-term containment, negotiation, arms control type of strategy could produce a peaceful outcome of a nuclear-free Korea and a unified Korea. That has to be our goal. We can't say we want to live forever with nuclear-armed North Korea and a nuclear umbrella from the United States over South Korea. To me, that's a recipe for living on a precipice for a very long time. We may be there in the short term, but George Kennan, in his famous X article, this is the mastermind or the originator of the idea of containment during the Cold War, said that eventually our strategic containment has to be a temporary solution because we need to have internal changes come in our adversary. Now that's a peaceful way of having regime change. And I think it is possible that a very long-term vision that could enable North Korea to gradually grow and have reforms could end up creating that. But recall that the end of the Cold War wasn't entirely a stable situation. the Russian regime, the Soviet regime collapsed with lots of nuclear weapons in it. And we were really fortunate to get out of that situation without a conflict. So this is going to be a long-term, difficult process, and we have to do what we can with respect to arms control and negotiations to make sure that it ends peacefully.
Would a collapse of North Korea be the worst of all outcomes, in the sense for the Chinese, certainly, because they would have this influx of migrants in the millions, for South Korea, but also for stability throughout? Is a collapse the worst of all worlds?
Well, it depends whether the collapse is a sudden and a shocking one, or whether it's a reform and a collapse of the regime without that sudden, shocking falling apart. If it's the sudden, shocking falling apart, I think it is potentially a disaster. First off, because of the migration problems into the north, and second, they have nuclear weapons. This is not a situation we talked about. Well, we want to deter them selling something, but if you have loose nukes in a country that's facing a big collapse, that creates this problem of somebody selling them off or sneaking them out of the country. So we don't want to have that. Whatever happens with North Korea, we want it to occur in a slow process, hopefully with international actors all cooperating together. And that means that we should stop threatening them and start making deals that are in both sides' interests, and only threaten if they do something that violates the agreement, to do something that's reciprocal in kind, but not to start a preventive war over there.
So I'm going to give you a question that goes well beyond your expertise and see what happens. This questioner asks whether the negotiating approach of Donald Trump is one that you would use in real estate, may make sense in real estate, but may not when it comes to a nuclear standoff. What's similar? What's different?
Oh, boy. Well, in real estate, you can walk away from the deal. And in this, you can't really walk away from the deal, because you're going to have to live with this state. Maybe the real estate would be similar if you're talking about a neighbor that's got dangerous arms and you're trying to buy something. But in real estate, you can either cut the deal and you can threaten to walk out, and if you need to, you can walk out.
And the collateral damage is not large.
And the collateral damage is not large. This is a very different situation. I do want to note, however, that Donald Trump did not write The Art of the Deal. Indeed, he didn't even read the art of the deal. So I think he has had some skills as a real estate tycoon, but also has not been a particularly good negotiator in much of his career. So I think we should not assume that a playbook that he did there would succeed in another different area.
Much has been made, and you referred to the fact that Kim Jong Un has now been able to meet with President Xi of China, with Putin of Russia, perhaps Assad of Syria. Some have argued, well, we've given him too much by offering him a meeting with the President of the United States. It gives him legitimacy. It gives him standing on the world stage. Two questions about that. Does it matter that we did? Is that really cost-free in the end? And the second is, would he conclude this legitimacy comes not just from meeting with the President of the United States, but for being a nuclear country?
Does it matter? I think yes, and you've already seen that it matters. Kim Jong Un has successfully pushed some wedges between the United States and the South Koreans. So already, part of our credible deterrent is some of the exercises that we've done. Earlier last month, the South Koreans, for the first time that I know of, said, no, we don't want to participate in some of the military exercises that you are initiating. And that's because they thought that we had gone too far. So I think that Kim Jong Un's legitimacy by acting as the more reasonable player, by going to South Korea, has already hurt the American solidarity of our relationship with the ROK.
But the South definitely wants this summit to happen.
Oh
Isn't
yes,
that right?
yes. No, I think that if this ends up with a positive agreement in the end, I think the person who would deserve the Nobel Prize would be President Moon.
Yeah.
He's the one who saved the summit when it was falling apart. He's the one who's taken some of the big giant steps at home. And I think President Moon wants to go to Singapore soon afterwards to try to get involved. The Singapore Agreement, if it does happen, could be an end of the war, but it wouldn't necessarily be a peace treaty. Peace treaty requires a lot more of the parties to be involved and spell out what the requirements are. How would you verify it? What would come next? What kind of reconciliation would occur? And so I think President Moon is going to be the next big player on the world stage.
Your answer, you've almost answered the next question, which was whether or not President Moon is the one who'll turn out to have been the great negotiator at all of this.
I hope so. I mean, that this is if there's a real positive solution. And right now, I think he's looking very good.
So thank you so much, Scott.